Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today on this Thursday. You know, it's interesting. We pick these webinar dates months in advance, and sometimes it's just funny how things work out. As you'll hear in the presentation today, it is a very important, significant day in the new markets tax credit world. So we're very excited to talk to you today, not only about the program, but news that dropped just this morning. In regards to some exciting things that are happening. I am Wes Ernst. I'm a partner with Forvis Mazars. I sort of wear two hats from a day-to-day perspective, an auditor by trade, primarily in the healthcare space, particularly with community health centers. And then alongside Mike, I co-lead kind of our new market service line and all things that kind of work together in that regard. Mike?
Thanks, Wes, and good afternoon, everyone. Afternoon for most of us now in the continental United States. My name is Michael Roney. I'm based here in Cleveland, Ohio. I've been with Forvis Mazars a little over 2 years now. Before that, I was in another Big Four accounting firm doing all things new markets. So my background is kind of all things new market tax credits and has been for the better part of my career. And Wes has mentioned today is a very exciting day in the new markets world. 104 new allocatees have received allocation as of this morning. So we will talk more about what that's like. But our planning couldn't have been better. We got very lucky with setting this date and having it kind of fall into our laps. So very excited to be here, and hopefully we can provide some good content and some good information and background as far as the program goes.
Thanks, Mike. And just so you all kind of know what to expect this afternoon, we've got the agenda up on screen. Really, the two of us have kind of divided this presentation in half, so to speak. But this is sort of an introductory style of content. This is meant to some extent to just kind of, for those who've never heard of it, get a sense of what the program is and kind of how it works, and then some of the key considerations of how you might take advantage of it, quite honestly. So we'll walk through some of those things at a high level, but also in a little bit more detail. Mike will take you through some of the key players. I think, when we put together the learning objectives, each presentation is a little bit different. If I was in your shoes listening in, I think if we kind of could boil it down to maybe one particular item, what we would look for as much as anything isn't necessarily a full understanding of how the program works. You'll hear it's quite complicated and sort of difficult sometimes in its structure and other aspects. It's more about awareness. I often use the phrase that this new markets program is boutique. That's usually the adjective I like to use. And what I mean by that is just it's fairly small, as you'll hear, in terms of the scope of, quite honestly, the federal budget overall. And so it's just not something that's particularly widely known across much of the country. So simply by walking away after listening in this afternoon and saying, okay, I don't know chapter and verse on how all of this works, but I sure know what it is now, and I at least know kind of when I might be able to engage with the program. I think that is at its core, kind of what we're trying to convey in this particular program that you walk away with. And with that in mind, we do have our first polling question, as you heard from the intro. We do have CPE available, so please answer these polling questions as you go through to make sure that you get your credit. And this first one is just sort of a setting question. So what is your current familiarity with the NMTC program? Is it A, nothing at all? B, I've heard of it, but really don't understand how it works. C, I've got a good, strong working knowledge of it and have even maybe sort of participated in one of the transactions before, or maybe even more so, I regularly work with NMTCs, sort of day in and day out. Just guessing, given hopefully the intro, or excuse me, the topic and subject matter of the presentation today, that we're probably going to end up in the A and B category most often. And like I said, that's why, as much as anything, this is about awareness today and taking away. I hope it comes through. You know, Mike and I have been doing this for a while. We really, really enjoy this program and just get excited talking about it. And I hope you will a little bit as well. And that looks like it plays out. So excellent. So close to 90% of everybody is sort of in this for the first time. And that's how we've structured this program. All right. So what is it? A couple sort of framework ways to think about this that I think are important to just kind of have in the back of your head as you sort of think about what you're hearing from us. I don't, again, level setting items, but I think it's important to understand we're going to talk about projects, large capital investments, things of that nature, other elements of the program. But at its core, this was something that was created to help communities. It is a community-oriented, or as you see bolded there, community development program, particularly designed to help low-income areas. And you can see it has an oversight agency, the CDFI Fund. When we talk about some of the exciting news of today, you'll see that name come up. But that's a division of the Treasury, and they are the overseer of this community development program. I like to stress that as people get into transactions and you're sort of worrying about all the paperwork and how all the funding and cash flow works associated with the tax credit program, sometimes it's easy to sort of forget that behind the scenes, there's something really sort of neat going on for the particular community that might be involved. And so that is what this is after, is community development. And it's an incentivizing program for private capital. Talk a little bit more about that in the history slide that's coming up next. And then for those of you that are CFOs, CEOs, management in some capacity at an organization here today, whether that's a not-for-profit, whether that's healthcare, whether that's manufacturing, and you're looking at your long-term strategic plans, particularly as it comes to large-scale projects, think of this as a financing tool. You have a big project that's 10 or 20 or $30 million in spend. You have to come up with a way to pay for that, right? You can borrow, you can use existing cash, equity, grants, contributions, any number of things. This, in many ways, in very simple terms, is just another tool in that toolbox. It's another way to source side of the equation when it comes to how are we going to pay for a large scale project. And that is related to the idea in some ways that the tax credits, as you'll see, are somewhat irrelevant for most of the people on this call, depending on what your role is, but they are not necessarily something to be concerned about as you're going through that. I'm not saying that they're not important, but just usually this audience cross-section is one where when you ask the question, okay, I'm participating in some new markets tax credit transaction, what does that mean for the tax credits? Again, as you'll hear from Mike here in a few slides, in large part, not a whole lot, because those are really just a carrot to attract that. Background, just a little bit of history about how this came to be and then where we are today. This program was developed roughly 25 years ago. Again, back to that community concept, you had a situation where Congress looked around at the end of the 90s and said, we have a major investment problem in low income areas, right? For one reason or another, that sort of cycle of unemployment, poverty, low income tends to continue in perpetuity because it can be very hard to attract capital to those areas, whether that's because banks consider those loans higher risk and so are a little bit more reluctant to do it, what have you. There's a perpetuation of a problem here that we need to figure out a way to solve. And that is kind of what this is designed to do, is to kind of get a bunch of different parties at the table in a way that everybody can kind of walk walk away from a particular community project with some benefit. So it's been around for 25 years now. Its current funding level is $5 billion per year, as you can see there in the second bullet. And it's not a permanent part of the tax code. This is something that is sort of renewed on a periodic basis, sometimes annually, sometimes, every, biannually. In this case, the most recent renewal lasts five years. And the awards for this come out in annual increments. So we're at 5 billion, but you can see historically there's been 20, or actually 19 on this slide. But of course, we made this slide before we got to the day today. So now there are 20 award rounds. And it at least from a numbers perspective, hopefully you can see some of those at the bottom. I mean, you're talking about fairly good returns. I mean, $1 spend to get $8 of private investment. You've got an 8-to-1 ratio there, and quite a bit in terms of what has this done over the 2.5 decades or close to it that it's been in, been around. I mean, close to $250 million worth of space created in a lot of different states and a lot of different, localities, what have you, and a lot of businesses involved as well. And that's maybe just kind of the last thing that I'll mention before I turn it over to Mike. It's just a reminder that this is a federal program. So no matter what state you're coming to from us today, this is something that applies kind of no matter where you're sitting throughout the country right now. You might say when you hear that, well, I feel like I've heard about something from, there's a Louisiana state tax credit program. And that certainly could be the case because of, quite honestly, the popularity and success of the federal program. Several states have put in, similar looking structures. So it could be possible that the state you're in, but for the purposes of today, we're really talking about kind of the national version of new markets.
So Wes set the stage for kind of where did this program come from? How long has the CDFI Fund been around? And actually, this year marks the 30th anniversary of the creation of the CDFI Fund. So the program itself has been, almost as long as the CDFI Fund has been around. So we're getting into the current state of the program. And there was actually a CDFI Fund advisory board meeting this morning where they announced the new allocation award of $5 billion. So even though it says fall of 2024, it's actually September 19th, 2024. 104 new allocatees received their slice of $5 billion in tax credit authority. As far as other milestones go, we are expecting one more application round. That round, the CDFI Fund announced it will be a $10 billion, so double what we've experienced in the past 3 to 4 years. This will mark the largest single award in the history of the program. In 2015, 2016, those of you who have been around long enough knew that they being the CDFI Fund, combined that award round into $7 billion. So again, largest single award to be expected. The new application window won't open until 2025, though. So then the history of the program on an annual basis, about this time next year, we do expect that $10 billion of allocation to be announced. As Wes mentioned, this program is set to expire at the end of next year. Over time, they've extended it. Congress has extended it 8 times in the past 23 years. It is one of the very few programs that both sides of the aisle tend to agree on. Seems like every session of Congress, both a bill from the House and the bill from the Senate is put forth that would make the program permanent. There are various advocacy groups out there who want to make the program permanent and want to make it more impactful. Part of that is just due to the fact that it's very successful from a funding standpoint. If the government gives out $1 funding and they get $8 in private investment in return, usually that's a pretty good metric for return on investment. And so because of that, as soon as congressmen, as soon as senators hear about the success of the program and they see a project that's been completed in their district, they're usually a strong supporter. And as of today, there's legislation in both the House and the Senate would put it forward. But as we know, in Congress and in Washington, things don't always happen in a timely fashion. So that's still sitting out there in the various levels of committee. And we touched on this a little bit, but I think it's worthwhile to just kind of let everyone know how impactful this program can be. Every year, the CDFI Fund puts out a sample impact report. The latest one came out earlier this year, and they had data through fiscal year 2022. So we are a little bit behind, but kind of just a couple highlights for you. And this report is available on the CDFI Fund website as well, so you can see it in its entirety. But so far, and this kind of tracks with the outcomes that we've seen, nearly 70% of the program dollars have been directed to real estate projects, commercial, construction, rehabilitation costs. That can also include the funding of new businesses that are building a building. It can also include, community facilities, healthcare facilities that are operating a new FQHC. It can be a new YMCA, et cetera. All those are good examples of the type of projects that we've seen. The numbers themselves here for the investment purposes are laid out for you, but the idea here is that all the dollars so far have been accounted for, and most, if not all, have gone into businesses and real estate concerns. So there are a couple other outliers, but when you look at the scale here, 76 billion in allocation awarded as of yesterday, 81 billion in allocation awarded as of today. Just the raw numbers, there's billions of dollars have been funneled into worthy projects, into businesses, and most importantly, into communities of need. So with that, we'll take it over to the next polling question. And this one is just, hopefully it's an easy one. True or false, over time, the majority of the New Markets Tax Credit Program dollars have been spent on real estate projects. And we use that as a broad term, real estate. Is that A, true, B, false, C, both, or D, neither? And I believe on one of the slides we had, there's been hundreds of thousands of manufacturing space created over the life of this program. It's brought jobs. Essentially, kind of what we look at, or what the industry looks at, is, are we funneling dollars into the right types of projects, and are we funneling dollars into areas of the country that need it the most? So we'll get into a little bit of kind of how we measure that and some of the metrics that go along with determining that. But overall, when the CDFI Fund is looking at this, they're going, are these projects being directed into the type of communities and type of facilities we want to see?
Mike, question for you. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit before we get into the next slide, just about this concept of project type, and maybe just give the audience a little bit of background / context when it comes to kind of how the politics side can impact investment. And I mean that in the sense of, you and I have talked about, depending on who is in, the executive branch at any given time, sometimes that can have an influence on sort of project type.
Yes. So I think kind of what you need to think about in this space is it's very competitive, and there's only so many dollars that go around. So we say $5 billion. That sounds like a lot, but if you split it among 100 or so organizations, that's roughly 50 million per organization. And in this space, you usually have at least 4, if not 5 times the demand or the request for dollars than are actually awarded. So many groups try to come up with a very compelling strategy, and some of that is driven by where they're located or where they want to invest, but other times it's influenced by, as you mentioned, project type. So in industry, for that matter, so manufacturing, healthcare, access to healthy foods, and I mentioned those kind of to your point, Wes. When the Obamas were in the White House, you saw a lot of groups come forward and want to push healthy foods or access to foods to overcome food deserts. You also saw during the Trump years an emphasis on manufacturing, and now in some of the Biden years, you've seen a kind of a push towards healthcare and equality, and those are not necessarily directed or provided as guidelines by the CDFI Fund, but many groups think that when you have an agency who's supposed to execute on behalf of the Congress or execute on behalf of a president's agenda, some of those things tend to be in somewhat lockstep. So that kind of brings us to, okay, we've got the program was founded, we've got kind of where we sit today. It's from a dollars perspective. Well, who participates in this program, and more importantly, kind of why do they participate? The program was designed at its very core to alleviate the absence of investment in low-income communities. Well, low-income communities, just by way of thought and thinking through this a little bit, kind of what was Congress's plan here? Traditional capital markets assess investments based on risk. When you have a low-income community that has a high poverty rate or has low wealth or high unemployment, there's not the risk profile is difficult to overcome for some of those traditional capital markets to want to invest in those areas because they think they're not going to get a return on investment. We could argue, is that right or wrong? Not for us to really decide, but that was kind of what Congress is looking at. How do we direct dollars? How do we encourage dollars to go into these areas? So in order to participate in the program, a low-income community must be high poverty. It must have low wealth, and it must be or either not these things aren't all required, but you have to have some element of this, and it must be in a census tract determined at the census level by the census that meets one of the above criteria. So, and I touched on, traditionally these areas are underfunded, and the program, according to the CDFI Fund, is to break this cycle. It does so by attracting private investment that's necessary to reinvigorate struggling local economies. Well, who is the entity or groups that direct those dollars to these low-income communities? That would be what we call the community development entities, or CDEs. Community development entity is just a certified group, either a partnership or a LLC, that is just an intermediary for the facilitation of loans through the New Markets programs. They are reviewed and certified by the CDFI Fund. So anyone who receives an allocation award or participates in the New Markets program with those federal dollars has been reviewed, has been cleared by the federal government. These CDEs, they come in all different shapes and sizes. So today's award announcement, we saw that there's roughly 40% are multi-state or national groups. Some of them are regional, just a couple states, and some of them are hyper local. Here I am in Cleveland, Ohio. Fortunately, two of the groups that are based in Cleveland received an allocation award today. So the greater Cleveland area has some New Markets dollars that are being afforded to it and funded it to worthy projects here in my local area. So it has a hometown impact for me. On these CDEs, they are for-profit entities, they're nonprofit entities. Like I said, they focus on specific geographies, and then they focus on specific community goals. We touched on a little bit, Wes, in answering your kind of like setup question there, but they can be in manufacturing, they can be in healthcare, they can be job creation, they can be access to services. And if you begin with the end in mind for a CDE perspective, when a CDE applies for these dollars, they outline kind of what outcomes and what projects they might want to invest in, and all that alignment and the types of projects that they eventually do invest in. If it meets those needs, they get a good opportunity to go back to the government and say, we did all these great things, give us some more dollars.
So Mike, it's worth reiterating, if you wouldn't mind clicking back a slide there, because we had a good question come through in the chat. People, as always tends to happen in this, they quickly figure out, at a base level, it sounds like there's some dollars available here for my organization, and I've got, this project that I want to undertake, and this sure sounds pretty good. So very frequently the natural question is, well, where do I apply? How do I get my hands on this? And I know you'll touch on it. These CDEs, those who are successful, they are in effect subcontractors, right? If you think about what happens functionally, as that $5 billion is effectively created in the discretionary budget, DC doesn't necessarily know where to send it. It can go anywhere throughout the country. They don't necessarily, Congress that is, have close tabs on good manufacturing projects in Arizona or excellent healthcare projects in Colorado. So they long ago figured out that the best way to steer money was to create this application process whereby these special purpose entities will apply and receive the funding, and then they really become the gatekeeper. So just kind of, not to put too fine a point on this idea, where do I apply for this? It becomes very, very important to be able to effectively court these entities.
No, that's a very fair point. And, unfortunately in this space, there's no centralized process for applying for funding. And I think kind of from a project standpoint, or if you're, a CFO and you're sitting and how do I finance this new expansion? How do I buy this piece of equipment? The New Markets Program is a potential possibility so long as you meet the requirements to participate. But to your point, yes, the CDEs, they're the ones who have the purse strings, and they're the ones who apply for those dollars from the government. And I heard this before, and I'll kind of repeat it again, not as my own comment, but the government's not in the business of picking winners and losers as far as investments in local communities. And I'll hit on this a little bit later, but the CDEs, they really are the boots on the ground who spend time in the low-income communities, who meet the members who live there, who understand the needs of those individuals. So they're in a better position to decide, if we want to use that word, or at least to evaluate, I think is maybe a better way of saying it, evaluate which projects really do meet the parameters of the program and would benefit most from participation. And of course, there aren't that many dollars to go around. Kind of what is centralized in this process is applying to the government and the government awarding via a scored application, via a pretty rigorous framework of kind of, do you as a CDE meet the requirements, and do you have projects that we think meet the requirements and parameters of the program? If that's the case, CDEA, we will give you some dollars, and then once you give out those dollars, report back to us on how you did, and we'll evaluate you on a going forward basis. And if you apply again, we'll use your track record to decide if you should get some more. So the idea here is that ultimately over time, a CDE wins. They identify where the best projects are, and hopefully the program eradicates itself. I think that's kind of the end goal. I heard on the advisory board meeting this morning, the current director goes, my goal is not to necessarily get rid of the CDFI fund, but if we do our job right, there's not going to be a need for the CDFI fund to inject capital into low communities, and for there to be a need for a governmental agency to provide any sort of economic development incentive. It should just take care of itself, which is a noble idea, but for the time being, this is the best we have.
Mike, just on that, because I think it's a worthwhile example, would you mind telling the story of Over the Rhine as it pertains to new markets?
Sure. So Wes is in Virginia today at a conference, but he is from the Cincinnati area, and I went to school outside of Cincinnati, so we both hold the Queen City in our hearts a little bit. There is an area north of downtown Cincinnati called Over the Rhine. As you can imagine, in any urban core, it was an area that had been thriving at one point in its history and had fallen on hard times. Businesses close, people move out. There's just not a lot of economic activity there. Well, several groups in the Cincinnati area, private groups, some of them quasi-governmental, said, let's use this New Markets Program and let's inject some dollars into the Over the Rhine. So if you look at the map of the census tracts 10 years ago, virtually the entire Over the Rhine area is qualified from a New Markets perspective for investment. If you look today, there's still some areas that qualified, but that map has changed from being in severely distressed to kind of prospering from an economic standpoint. It shows the power of continued investment and the power of some focused individuals using the tools at their disposal, like the New Markets Program, to make some positive change in communities. Of course, there's some downstream effects to that other people might argue, but from a case study perspective, some focused dollars into a community that needed it, turn that community around. Now it's a thriving area of Cincinnati that has, it's lively, that has energy, that has economic opportunity for folks. So we talked about, the dollars available. Well, how does this program actually inject dollars into these projects? Well, you need an investor, and these investors are the ones that want the tax credits. So they're the ones who actually offset their tax liability to the federal government by purchasing tax credits and taking those proceeds from the tax credits, loaning them, or essentially giving them to the CDEs, and those CDEs then turn around and inject those into worthy projects. These investors in today's market are traditionally your big banks. So Chase Bank participates, US Bank, PNC, Wells Fargo, Citi, Truist, several others. And they can be regional, they can be multinational, they can be essentially what they're doing though is they are participating for a couple of reasons. They may have a mission from their investment corp. US Bank is a good example. They have a impact finance team, and their mission is to help close the welfare and social inequality gap. So they use their investments to do that. They are also after what we call some of their regulatory points, the Community Revitalization Act points. So they get credit for these new markets investments to meet the needs if they've got brick and mortar locations or they have markets they need to invest in from the regulatory standpoint. And of course, they are after the tax credits. So they want to offset their liability, to help the organization from that standpoint as well. And what's most important, if you had to rank them, you need a worthy project in a qualified area, you need a CDE with money, and you need an investor who's willing to purchase that and make the whole thing go. They all are very important, but kind of not to put the cart before the horse. You need a project, they need a CDE, then you need an investor. But you need all of them to make the whole thing work. And we touched on this, the Qualic B or the project. Qualic B just means it's a qualified active low income business. Because it's government program, because it's regulated, we have a lot of hoops to jump through. And funding a project that's qualified for this program is just one of those hoops. Essentially, at the beginning, you will look to see if A, you're in a qualified area, and B, if you meet some of the definitions of a qualified business. I will say most organizations, most business types, most project types, most community centers, most nonprofits, what have you, all fit the definition of a qualified business in this space. It's a pretty broad definition. What doesn't count is some of what they call the sin businesses. So racetracks, liquor stores, golf courses, massage parlors, tanning salons, etc. And it kind of makes sense if you really take a step back and think about it. What helps a community most? Job creation, prosperity. Someone along the lines decided that those type of businesses are probably not going to be best for a struggling community, which again, we can argue if that's right or wrong, but that's just the rules we have to play by. So we touched on this, a little bit through some of the commentary, but just to kind of bring it home, the program is intended to help low-income community people, low-income communities. It's attempting to alleviate some of the long-term and consistent absence of investment in these communities, in these areas. And of course, if you don't have investment, then the cycle just perpetuates itself. What is great is that these investment decisions are made at the local level. So that's why you have the CDEs, who go to the government and say, we want to invest in Cleveland, Ohio. We want to invest in over the Rhine in Cincinnati. We want to invest in, Kansas City. We want to invest in, a couple of neighborhoods in Los Angeles, or we want to invest in the entire state of Minnesota. That's kind of, they have that opportunity to make those investment decisions because they know, the CDEs know where those dollars, would be best spent. And the community benefits themselves drive some of those investment decisions, which then lead to a focus on kind of what would help most for these communities: economic opportunity, i.e. job creation, access to services that may have been lacking. For in this space, you have healthcare is a big one, access to grocery stores, mental health facilities, wellness is a big push right now. And then you have training and workforce development. If you want to uplift a group of a cohort, you provide them some opportunities, and you provide them some opportunities to learn and expand their skill set. The idea here is that the CDEs are looking for those projects, and then we'll put those best aligned projects with the mission of the CDE, but also the mission of the program forward to receive those dollars. And then hopefully you get an over the Rhine situation where things start to improve over time, and you see no longer a need for that type of investment in that community because it's starting to take care of itself.
Mike, would you mind? I think, listening the community concept makes sense, but maybe using two of our recent examples, the food bank and the health center, explaining in specifics, what some of the considerations were in those situations from a community benefit side of things.
Sure. Without giving away names, we'll talk about, we had a Southern health center, let's call it that, where they were in an area where the local hospital closed. And so residents of that county, residents of that city were being forced to drive 60, 70, 80 miles to a hospital to receive basic routine medical care. And one of the prominent examples was they had, I think it was less than one full-time equivalent dentist in the greater county area. So no dental service offerings, driving an hour plus just for primary care, simple routine medical. And then so you had an organization who came in and said, we're going to purchase an old dilapidated Walmart that had moved out years before. We're going to turn that into a comprehensive, all under one roof, federally qualified health center. We're going to offer primary care, women's health, pediatrics, dental, behavioral health, diagnostics, CT scanning, the whole gamut, basically like a little mini hospital, but to fill that void of the hospital that left. Ended up being a very sizable project for that organization. Ended up being very complicated, but the community members you talked to were very excited about it. Wes and I went and visited it several times, got to see it from an idea into a concept on paper, into the construction of a building, etc. So you get this idea that, this feeling when you were there that this is not just a project of dollars on paper. This was an actual community need, actually was going to drive some real benefit to the community members. And kind of one of the takeaways after we had a debrief when the project was all finished was, hey, we've got a 6-month waiting list for dental services now. We're looking at expanding that even further. So it highlighted a need, B, it served the community in a positive way. And because the CDEs, the investors, were able to focus on something at a local level, meet an actual need, it had an immediate and direct positive impact. I think the other example Wes is alluding to is we had a food bank also in the South. Food insecurity post-COVID. Well, pre-COVID was very significant. Post-COVID, it was even more significant. They were expanding operations to distribute hundreds of thousands of pounds of food to counties in the South to alleviate the food security and to provide a safety net for folks who were wondering where their next meal was going to come from. That one is still under construction, so no direct impacts to report yet, no story to tell there yet, but we know it's going to do great things. So that's a great kind of tie into how does this help programs and businesses. It funds projects immediately, and it gives you access to dollars upfront. It reduces, it's not a pay for, the program itself does not pay dollar for dollar all of your expenses and all your construction costs, et cetera, but it does offset some of those so you can reallocate funds elsewhere. And probably most powerful in this space is the fact that if you borrow money through the New Markets Program, you're going to pay interest only. It's going to be an interest rate set at 1% to 2%, and it's going to be much more favorable terms than the market currently offers, even with yesterday's news of the Fed cutting interest rates by 50 basis points. We're still going to be far below that, so it'll be more advantageous to participate in the program. Okay. Which brings us, I know we glossed over this a little bit, but I think in the interest of time, we'll just go to the next polling question is how does the New Market Tax Credit Program help businesses? Provides low-cost financing. B, offers more favorable terms than traditional capital. C, addresses economic inequality and provides jobs to the community. Both A and B. And this is, from a business standpoint. One of the things maybe to touch on here is that when we say businesses, generally people in their mind go, okay, for-profit businesses. That's usually what they think of. I want to make it very clear in this program, we are talking about businesses as a broad definition. So nonprofits are a great candidate for this program. Education is a great candidate for the program. Your traditional quote unquote businesses that are for profit are great candidates for the program. And what we do, or what the program itself kind of has it built in place as a way to evaluate those type of projects. So that's generally why we say projects rather than saying businesses, just because a project can mean anything in the space. A business usually has a specific connotation we want to try to avoid. Both A and B, thank you. Very, very nice group. Everyone's paying attention and answering correctly, so good job. Okay, so we've kind of gone through who's participating, how this benefits, who it benefits, etc. Well, how does the program work mechanically? If I'm a business, or if I'm a project who's wanting to receive some of these new markets dollars, how do I go about that? Or how do I raise my hand and say, where do these dollars come from? Well, we talked about CDFIs CDEs being certified by the CDFI Fund. So what they do is they put together an application to the government on an annual basis. That application is lengthy. It covers not only what your organization is, what you've done in the past, and what you'd like to do in the future. The CDFI Fund scores that through a competitive process, and then they award allocation, like they did today, to a group of CDEs who meet their criteria. Today, 104 out of 196 were awarded, so not everyone gets it. It's very competitive. Generally, the award is made 9 months, 8 or 9 months after the application, so there is some sort of lag in the system. These facts and figures are from last round, so actually as of today, this is outdated. But the next award round, not just expected fall 2024, was announced earlier today. So very exciting times. From a process standpoint, maybe if we just want to touch on that, CDEs and investors, they review projects kind of continuously over the time frame, even though their allocation only comes on one day of the year. And the reason for that is, projects, because of the lag in this time between the CDE applying and the CDE receiving dollars, a lot of things can happen with a project. It can fall apart altogether. It can start construction, be completed. It can be still working on getting its financing together. So they being the CDs and the investors are constantly kind of putting together a pipeline of projects that might be good candidates depending on the timeline of the program. They underwrite them, they evaluate them. They're essentially looking for a couple things up front. Can it close successfully? Does it benefit the community? And kind of does it meet the parameters of the agreement that they've made with the government as far as what they would do? That let's assume that everything goes well and that your project is one of those who the CDE says, this is the one for us. This is going to improve this community. This is what we believe is going to do. And we wrote about this in our application. So therefore, we're going to give you an offer of financing, a term sheet. That term sheet will outline the cost, the fees, the timing, what to expect going into a new market tax credits closing. And then that closing, if everyone accepts those terms, will usually take between 60 and 90 days. Think of this as kind of like a real estate concern. You're buying and selling a home. The CDE is, making you an offer on your house. You as the project deciding if that offer meets your needs, and then once that offer is accepted, you move into that closing process. You bring in a whole bunch of third parties to, do your inspection, do your real estate appraisal, paper the transaction so it comports with the New Markets Program. And then once that's all said and done, everyone signs on the dotted line. You close the transaction. You receive your funding either directly to you based on current project costs or into a disbursement account that acts like a construction draw. So you'll make monthly draws on that until you expire those funds. The idea here being that to get from the idea of a concept to the completion of a project. There's a lot of steps in between. The New Market Tax Credit Program comes in to offset costs and to help fund the completion of that project. Of course, like any government program, there is a compliance piece, and then there's an unwind at the end. From a compliance standpoint, if you're a project, you will have to report back to the CDE kind of certain items that would make sense in this space. What do those community outcomes look like? How many jobs did you create if you had job creation as one of your targeted outcomes? How many people did you serve if you're a federally qualified health center or a grocery store, i.e., what sort of impact did you make in the community? Kind of, what are the metrics? What's the poverty rate year in and year out? What is the average medium income? Did we see that over the Rhine situation starting to happen? Are things improving? Fortunately, in this space, and this is usually one of the big concerns from groups is, okay, what happens if things don't go well? What if we say what we're going to do doesn't actually turn out to be the case? Two comments there. One, there's no clawback provisions in the new markets territory. If you've got a project that moves forward, even if you don't meet the prescribed community outcomes you were seeking, as long as you're continuing reporting and staying in compliance and moving forward, you're going to be okay. It's not the best outcome that CDs want to see, but it's certainly a risk that is involved. And then from a reporting standpoint, you will have to provide some financials and some narratives around kind of what's going on, how has this helped the community, et cetera. Generally, it's a community benefits report. It stays in place for 7 years. At the end of 7 years, when the tax credit's been claimed, and when everyone has seen the project take root, take hold as part of the community, the CDE has seen this project take root, take hold in the community, make some improvements, and the investors receive their tax credit, everyone tends to just collapse this, walk away, and the transaction unwinds.
Mike, would you mind, because I feel like this is sort of right what it's all about, so to speak, in this slide, or where the rubber meets the road. Take your pick of bad turn of phrase here, but the repayment concept, in terms of at the end of the day, what has happened here at the unwind point?
Great question. So if we go back for a moment, let's go back one slide and say you've closed your new market tax credit transaction. You have received the dollars that you have needed to complete the project, or you've been reimbursed for some of the costs you've already expensed. Hopefully, well before that 7-year time frame, you have completed the project, you're operational, and you're moving forward with your compliance process. So you've received your dollars and you have funded your project, you've completed your project. As long as you are meeting the needs of the CDE and reporting, in a timely basis, everything continues on until, that 7-year period. What's important to remember here, and I don't know if I touched on this, so I'll reiterate it. The financing that you receive, the dollars you receive, they come in the form of actual loans to the project, but those loans are interest only during that 7-year period, this compliance window. No principal can be paid on those. So, and the interest rate is 1% to 2%, much more favorable terms than traditional financing. So at the end of 7 years, when you go to unwind this transaction, you've made interest payments for 7 years, you've paid no principal, and then essentially, because everyone's walking away, you've got some financing that, if all things go well and you've structured this correctly, it turns into somewhat of a grant. So you're not going to have to pay back a portion, or you shouldn't have to pay back a portion of the new markets proceeds you've received. So essentially, if you're a non-for-profit, this becomes a really powerful tool where you go, I got some project cost offsets, got to reduce my financial outlay at the beginning, and at the back end, you're telling me a portion of the loans I received I don't have to pay back, and they turn into a grant. That is really powerful stuff. Of course, everything in between has to go right there. So we don't want to say it's a guarantee, but in many cases, there is some sort of forgiveness that occurs here. And the program operates like a 7-year grant program.
Worth stressing, Mike, if you don't mind, also is just some general parameters. I mean, when you hear the phrase free money, it's easy to get excited. This is not 100% cost coverage style of program. This is meant as gap filling, sort of last in type financing. We get a lot of people who say, this is great, this will cover the cost of my project. That is not what it's designed to do. And conceptually, that hopefully makes sense after what you've heard, which is clearly there's a scarcity of dollars. So there's a desire from a federal programmatic perspective to stretch the dollars as far as they can go. And in doing so, that means that no one project will receive, an enormous swath of its budget from the New Markets Program. We typically tell people that the best rule of thumb is whatever your project budget is, assuming you receive an allocation of that same amount, the New Markets cash equity from that outside investor ultimately covers around 15 to 20% of the budget. So a $10 million project, somewhere between 1.5 to 2 million is the cost coverage by being successful in receiving an allocation. We just want to make that clear. Additionally, it's worth mentioning that there's a significant complexity transaction cost associated with this. So you do typically want to see some scale in terms of project size, usually 5 million and up. And Mike, I'll let you piggyback on those comments.
Yeah, when we say 5 million and up, just from a starting point, because there's some significant transaction costs involved here. Similar to your real estate closing, when you see all those line items for people who get paid at closing, the same thing tends to happen in a New Markets transaction. You have a batch of lawyers who gets paid, you have a batch of accountants who gets paid, and you have some closing costs that get paid out of the transaction. So essentially, to make sure that to borrow the phrase, the juice is worth the squeeze, 5 million and up usually makes it worthwhile. Otherwise, you're starting to really pinch some pennies and wonder if the benefit is really going to make a difference for that project. And I see a question in the chat, how much is usually forgiven? It's a portion, it's usually that, that 10 to 15% or 15 to 20%, benefit you receive. Usually that's the portion that gets forgiven. So it's a rough estimate there. On a $10 million deal, you're talking maybe $1.5 million. That's estimated. The caveats being every situation is different and every deal is a little bit different. But there's in a later webcast, in a more deep dive kind of technical cash flow review, you'll be able to understand kind of how the money flows through the system, how the transaction, and then kind of where it ends up washing out at the end, which that's another hour, another day for us to talk through that. So I think in kind of wrapping up here, getting close to wrapping up, it's just some overarching thoughts. Why does this New Markets Tax Credit Program work? And why has it been around for 23 years, 25 years at this point? It's location specific. Only the most distressed communities, A, qualify, and B, receive dollars. So the industry and the program does a lot of self-regulation, and only those groups who spend dollars in the distressed locations, the most distressed locations, seem to be the ones who are repeat winners. From a stat from today, from the 104 new allocatees who received $5 billion in allocation today, 85% of them have committed to investing in areas that are even worse off than you might expect from the program perspective. So that would tell you that they're really trying to, they being the CDEs, the industry, is really trying to focus the dollars into the most disadvantaged areas of the country. It drives real economic benefits, and those investment decisions, as we kind of harped on today, are made by CDEs at the local level. So it's not the government saying, coming in and saying, build this bridge to nowhere. It's saying, no, we need this bridge because it's going to create jobs, it's going to open up economic avenues for folks. And I think we can't emphasize this enough. It's one of the few kind of feel-good programs where you do feel part of a team as you're going through one of these transactions. It's not buyer versus seller in any form or fashion. It's much so, it's like your King Arthur's Knights of the Round Table. Everyone has a spot at the table. Everyone seems to be somewhat equal, and everyone's trying to move the ball forward, so to speak, to benefit the communities at the end of the day. So it's a very collegial, very team atmosphere, and everyone's trying to work together. Another thing is that when a CDE or a new markets investor commits to a project, they are going to be in it for at least 7 years. So it's not just we say flash in the pan. No, there's a long lasting relationship here. You're forming a relationship with the CDE. You're forming a relationship with the investor. You know, you get to that 7-year itch and everyone says, okay, it's time for us to be done. And of course, businesses have been financed, hundreds of thousands of manufacturing space has been created. And we always go back to, for every $1 of federal funds that's spent by this program has created $8 in economic activity elsewhere. So very positive program, very strong bipartisan support. Wes, any final thoughts on your end to kind of emphasize or to recap anything on the presentation today?
I think, thanks, Mike. We're 2 minutes from time again, and there's I answered several questions in the chat, but I started to fall behind there. We will answer all of these after the conference. For those of you who have asked, we will let you know. I hope that, like I said at the beginning, that in large part this is an awareness thing. There's a lot of really good specific questions, but at the end of the day, hopefully what people heard was I need to pay attention to this because I have, for some reason or another, something that I think might be a match for this program. And so certainly appreciate all the questions. It's a really great program, and thanks for taking the time today. Mike, any last thoughts from your perspective? Otherwise we can wrap it up.
No, I just want to say thank you all for joining. Hopefully it's been informative for you. And yes, we will. It'll take us a little while to answer the questions, but we do endeavor to anyone who asks a question today to reach out to them directly following the webinar and answer as best we can. If it takes a further conversation, happy to have that as well.
Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure being with you today.